Why was she still standing? The coke ran down her hair, cold against the heat of the Afghan sun, sticky on her neck, staining her uniform until it clung to her skin. Around her, 30 soldiers fell silent. Some turned away. Some pretended to laugh. And one man, the captain, stood grinning, proud of his own cruelty. Captain Derek Holland had thought it was funny. "You look like you could use a shower, sweetheart," he said, still holding the empty can as it dripped onto the sand. His voice carried across the motor pool, mixing with the whine of distant generators and the smell of diesel. To him, it was just another Tuesday, another day to remind someone lower in rank who held power here. But what he didn't know, what no one here knew, was that the woman he just humiliated wasn't just another lieutenant. And in 72 hours, the name on her uniform would come back to end his career in a way he would never see coming. Bryn Castillo didn't move, didn't speak. She stood there, shoulders squared, hands clenched so tight her knuckles turned white beneath her gloves. The coke soaked through her blouse, dripped down her sleeves, gathered at her boots. The heat made everything worse. July in Ghazni province was cruel, 115 degrees before noon, the air heavy with dust and burnt oil. She could have shouted, could have reported him on the spot, could have thrown the empty can back in his face and given the 30 soldiers watching something to cheer for, but she didn't. Because the moment she did, she'd lose something more important than pride. She'd lose control. She took one breath, then another. No words, no expression, just quiet, deliberate composure, the kind that made people uneasy because it said, "You will regret this, just not today." Someone from her platoon shifted beside a Humvee, half raising his hand as if to help. She didn't look at him, didn't give anyone a chance to step between her and humiliation, because she knew every soldier watching was learning how to respond to weakness. If she broke now, they'd remember it for the rest of the deployment. Captain Holland laughed again, the kind of laugh that fills silence like static. "Don't take it personal, Lieutenant. It's just a joke." A joke, that word hit harder than the coke. Bryn turned away, picked up the maintenance log from the hood of the nearest MRAP, wiped a line of sticky residue from the page, marked a missing inspection, and keyed her radio. "Alpha Convoy, reassign Bravo 2 to secondary bay. Double-check transmission seals before 900. Her voice was steady, professional. And then, without a single glance at the man who tried to break her, she walked off the motor pool floor. Inside her office, the air conditioner barely worked. The hum of it filled the silence, and for the first time in 20 minutes she let her hands tremble. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on a blank wall, feeling the soda dry into her skin. Her heart pounded with anger so sharp it almost hurt, not just because of the humiliation but because of the witnesses, because she could still see their faces, the discomfort, the silence, the half-smiles. She had seen that silence before, in training, in briefings, in promotions that went to someone louder, not better. But this time, something inside her shifted. Her father's voice came back, clear and calm. "Respect is earned, not given. And once earned, you never surrender it." Bryn was 29 years old, a first lieutenant 6 months into her first deployment. She had been taught to earn respect the hard way. Logistics wasn't glamorous. It was grit, sweat, and math. It was the invisible work that kept others alive. Every convoy, every resupply, every truck that left the wire carried her signature, her responsibility. She didn't wear medals. She didn't need to. Her father, Brigadier General Victor Castillo, had once told her that leadership wasn't about being followed. It was about being trusted. He'd served in 3 wars, carried men home who never made it, and taught her that power without character was poison. She had chosen the army not because of him, but because she believed the uniform still meant something. And right now, drenched in soda in a forgotten corner of Afghanistan, she felt that belief crack. For a few long minutes she did nothing, just sat there motionless. The hum of the fan sounded louder than it was. Then she reached for a towel, wiped her face clean, and straightened her collar. Her hand hovered over the radio. She wanted to call her platoon sergeant, maybe just to hear another voice, but she didn't. Because something in her had already decided this wouldn't be handled with emotion. It would be handled right. She opened her laptop, typed the subject line slowly. Incident report. Unprofessional conduct / Fob Gasney Motorpool / 21, July 2014. Each word felt like a bullet casing hitting concrete. Cold, measured, permanent. She detailed every second of what had happened. Time, location, witnesses. No adjectives, no opinion, just facts. That was how she'd been raised, to build a record, not a reaction. When she finished, she stared at the screen. The cursor blinked at the bottom like a heartbeat. Then she saved the file, printed it, and placed it in a folder with her name on the tab. As the printer hummed, her thoughts drifted back to the motor pool, to Holland's laugh, to the way some soldiers had looked away. She wasn't angry at them. She understood. The military had a way of teaching silence, how to stay out of trouble, how to survive the system. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that her silence was part of the same system. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Sergeant Kim, her convoy lead, sharp, loyal, one of the few who'd earned her full trust. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "about earlier." She looked up. "Don't, not now." He nodded, understood. She could see it in his eyes, the respect, the confusion, the anger he wanted to show but wouldn't. "Just keep the team focused," she said softly. "Convoy ops don't stop because people act like idiots." "Yes, ma'am," he hesitated. "For what it's worth, you handled it better than I could have." She didn't answer, just nodded once. When he left, the silence returned. Outside, the Afghan sun was lowering behind the ridges. Shadows stretched long over the base. In the distance, the sound of a helicopter faded into the haze. She took off her stained blouse, hung it behind the door, and poured bottled water over her hair to rinse the last of the stickiness away. She wanted to cry, maybe, but she didn't. Because tears weren't weakness, they were relief, and she hadn't earned relief yet. That night, she wrote a short email to her father. She didn't mention what had happened. Just said she was proud of her platoon, that operations were running smoothly, and that she was learning more about leadership every day. She signed it. "Love you, Dad, I'm fine, always fine." She didn't know he was already packing for an inspection trip to Regional Command East. That in 72 hours, his boots would hit the same dust she walked on. But part of her, some deep, quiet intuition, knew something was coming. The next morning, she took the incident report to her battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. He was a good man, fair, the kind who listened before talking. She handed him the folder, her hands steady. "Sir, this is a report of unprofessional conduct by Captain Derek Holland, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion." He didn't interrupt as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what happens if I forward this?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "It could get political. He's got friends up the chain." "So do I," she said quietly, then added, "but I'm not asking for favors, just accountability." Something in Hayes' eyes softened. "Understood, Lieutenant, I'll handle it." She saluted, turned to leave. "Bryn," he said before she reached the door, "you did the right thing." She nodded once and walked out without a word. Outside, the air smelled of dust and jet fuel. Soldiers moved between tents and vehicles, life on deployment rolling on as if nothing had happened. But under that rhythm, she could feel something shifting, a slow current of respect, the kind that doesn't need applause. Later that afternoon, she saw Captain Holland across the yard, laughing with another officer. He didn't look worried. Probably thought the whole thing would vanish into paperwork. And maybe it would. Maybe the system would protect him again, the way it always did. But Bryn wasn't waiting for revenge. She had work to do, convoys to organize, lives depending on her precision. Still, as she watched the horizon fade into orange and red, she thought of her father's words again. Words spoken years ago, when she was still a cadet. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just stands there, and that's enough. She didn't know yet how true that was. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the sound before justice arrives. What happens when silence starts to make noise? The report moved faster than anyone expected. One file, one email, one signature at a time, like a quiet fuse burning through layers of command. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had read it twice before forwarding it. His note was simple: recommend formal review under AR 620, unprofessional conduct. Pattern of behavior suspected. He didn't add opinion, just fact. He knew that in a system built on paperwork, the truth survived best when it looked boring. Bryn didn't ask for updates, she just did her job. Morning briefings, convoy planning, inspection schedules, it all kept moving. The base didn't pause for dignity. Out here, everyone was tired, everyone was counting days, and nobody wanted to get caught in the middle of someone else's fight. Still, the silence around her changed, subtle, uneasy. In the chow hall, soldiers who'd been there that day nodded to her now, small, quiet acknowledgments. Not pity, respect, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. Captain Holland still laughed too loud, still strutted through the motor pool like he owned the dust beneath his boots, but his jokes didn't land the same way. The laughter that followed felt forced, careful, like everyone knew something had shifted but didn't dare say it. Rumors had begun to ripple across the base, not about what happened, but about her. She didn't even react, someone whispered near the PX. Just stood there. Yeah, didn't say a word, just walked off like a damn statue. By the end of the week, even soldiers who hadn't been there had an opinion. Some called it strength, others called it arrogance. But the ones who mattered, the ones who served under her, called it leadership. And for Bryn, that was enough. But the Army has a way of testing patience. 2 days later, she got a quiet knock on her office door. Hayes stood there, sleeves rolled, a grim look in his eyes. Close the door, Lieutenant. She obeyed, heart steady but alert. Driscoll isn't acting on it, he said flatly. Sorry. Your report. He says Holland will be counseled informally. No investigation. Says the environment's stressful, that people joke around to cope. Bryn's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Hayes studied her. He's wrong, and we both know it, but his word outranks mine, and his old man served with Holland's father. Politics, not justice. For a long moment, neither spoke. The base generator hummed outside, rhythmic and indifferent. Finally, Bryn said, "Understood, sir. Thank you for trying." He leaned forward. "I'm not done trying, but I need you to understand something. The Army doesn't forget good officers who play the long game. Keep doing your job, be patient." She nodded, "Yes, sir." When he left, she stared at the door for a long time. Her fingers tapped against the desk, a quiet beat of frustration she couldn't show anywhere else. She'd done everything right, filed through the chain, followed procedure, and still the system looked the other way. Her father's voice echoed again. When the system fails you, you hold the line. Not for them, for you. That night, Bryn couldn't sleep. The desert outside pulsed with heat even after dark. In the distance, tracer fire flickered near the hills, like lightning that never made a sound. She lay in her cot, staring at the tent ceiling, wondering how many other officers had stayed silent. How many had swallowed humiliation because the paperwork wasn't worth it. Maybe that's why she felt calm, not broken. Because even if the report died in someone's inbox, at least there was a record now. A truth with her name on it. At 4:30, she woke early, put on a fresh uniform. The brown stains were gone, but she could still smell the faint sweetness of coke in the air, like a ghost that refused to leave. By 600, she was back in the motor pool, clipboard in hand, moving between vehicles as her soldiers checked engines and tire pressure. Sergeant Kim looked up from a Humvee hood. "Ma'am, I thought you'd take a day." "Convoy leaves at 900, she said simply. "Work doesn't wait." He smiled. "Good to have you back." She gave a brief nod, but her eyes were already on the horizon. For the next 2 days, she buried herself in work. Convoy manifests, fuel requests, cargo inspections, each detail a shield against frustration. Every soldier she led, every truck that rolled out safe, was proof that she could still lead with integrity. But beneath that calm surface, the fuse she'd lit was still burning. At brigade headquarters, the forwarded report sat in a secure inbox marked "Action Required." The base commander had noticed the attached note from Hayes, the mention of "pattern of behavior." It wasn't the kind of phrase you ignored, especially not with a general inspection coming up. The timing was coincidence, or maybe fate. Because on the third day after the incident, a transport helicopter touched down at Ghaznim's landing zone, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust. Soldiers nearby paused to watch the one-star flag stenciled on the fuselage. Brigadier General Victor Castillo had arrived. He wasn't there for his daughter. He didn't even know what had happened. His visit was scheduled weeks in advance, a standard operational assessment of logistics efficiency across Regional Command East. Still, fate has a dark sense of humor. The general stepped off the chopper, boots sinking into the Afghan dust, his eyes scanning the horizon with the calm sharpness of a man who'd seen too many deployments to count. He was accompanied by a small staff team, inspectors, analysts, aides. The base commander saluted, guided him toward the command tent, and within hours the entire installation knew the brass was on the ground. Holland heard it too. "Another inspection," he joked in the TOC, leaning back in his chair. "Great. Can't wait for them to tell us what we already know." Someone laughed politely, but even jokes sounded nervous when a general was involved. Meanwhile, Bryn had no idea her father was there. She was in the motor pool again, running through vehicle checklists before a resupply mission to forward Outpost Keating. Her hands were black with grease, her sleeves rolled up, the July sun turning everything to fire. At 1400 hours, a call came over the radio. "Lieutenant Castillo, report to Operations Conference Room for logistics briefing with the General's team." She froze for half a heartbeat, the wrench slipping slightly in her grip. Then she steadied her breath. Logistics briefing, standard procedure, nothing unusual. She had no reason to expect him. The walk from the motor pool to the conference tent felt longer than usual. Dust clung to her boots, to her mind. The guards outside saluted as she entered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and dry paper. She stopped halfway across the room. At the far end, in front of the map board, stood her father. General Castillo didn't smile, didn't blink in surprise, just nodded once, the kind of professional acknowledgement that said, "You are an officer, so am I, let's both act like it." Bryn's pulse steadied. She saluted sharply. "First Lieutenant Bryn Castillo, 10th Mountain Division, reporting as requested, sir." "At ease," he said, voice calm, unreadable. For the next 40 minutes, she briefed him and the inspection team on maintenance schedules, convoy delays, spare part shortages, and supply chain routes through the Coast Pass. Her voice didn't tremble once. Every number, every fact precise. Her professionalism was a wall no one could see through. Her father asked pointed questions. She answered them all. When the briefing ended, he simply said, "Thank you, Lieutenant. Good work." "Yes, sir." As she turned to leave, she caught the faintest flicker of pride in his eyes, but just for a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar steel of command. Outside, she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The sky above the base was washed pale with dust. Somewhere beyond the wire, distant thunder rolled from the mountains. She didn't know what her father would learn next. That night, as he reviewed incident reports from across the base, He would come across one file marked Unprofessional Conduct/Fob Gasney Motor Pool. He would read the name, and he would stop breathing for a moment. Then he would read every line twice. By morning, the quiet fuse would reach its end. In the Tactical Operations Center, Captain Holland laughed again, oblivious. "Can't wait to show the general how smooth our motor pool runs," he said. No one laughed this time, because somewhere beyond that laughter, a father was already making a call. What did it feel like, the moment power met truth? No one in the operations tent saw it happen, but word traveled fast. A general's tone changes things. His requests aren't suggestions, they're orders wrapped in calm authority. And that morning, Brigadier General Victor Castillo requested one specific file from the base's administrative office, an incident report filed by First Lieutenant Bryn Castillo. He read it in silence, line by line, no emotion, no pause, just that slow, quiet reading soldiers fear more than yelling. The paper didn't tremble in his hands, his expression didn't move, but something inside him hardened. Holland's name appeared again and again. Witnesses listed, statements attached, nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just the truth in perfect Army format, the kind that can destroy reputations without raising a voice. When he finished, he set the file down, stared at the beige wall of the briefing room and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, softly, "Call Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." The aide hesitated. "Sir, right away." 20 minutes later, Hayes entered the room, uncertain if he was being called for praise or punishment. He saluted, crisp but tense. "At ease, Colonel," the general said. "I reviewed your unit's operations, efficient, disciplined, but I have one question." "Yes, sir." "Why wasn't this acted on?" Castillo slid the report across the table. Hayes hesitated. "Sir, Driscoll refused to formalize it, said the environment was stressful, that." "That what?" Hayes swallowed. "That a formal complaint could damage morale, sir." Castillo's jaw tightened. He tapped the folder once. "Morale." His tone flattened the word until it sounded meaningless. "Sir," Hayes said carefully, "with respect, I believe this behavior's gone unchecked too long, but my authority ends where his begins," Castillo finished for him. "Understood." He closed the folder gently. "I'll take it from here." That sentence, the quiet finality of it, meant something was about to happen. Within an hour, Lieutenant Colonel Driscoll and Captain Holland were called to the base commander's office. No one told them why. Holland thought it was another routine check, maybe an informal council. He even smiled as he adjusted his uniform, muttering, "Guess the old man wants to make sure the general sees we're squared away." Driscoll didn't smile. He'd been around long enough to know generals don't schedule surprise meetings unless something's wrong. They entered the office to find General Castillo already seated. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind of heaviness that comes before a storm. The general didn't look up from the papers in front of him. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "sit." They obeyed. He flipped a page, made a note with his pen, and finally raised his eyes. "Captain Holland, you're familiar with First Lieutenant Bryn Castillo, yes?" Holland blinked. Yes, sir, logistics officer, runs convoys out of the motor pool, hard worker." "Hard worker," the general repeated. "Good. Then you'll recall an incident involving her on July 21st. Holland shifted, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "Sir, it was, if I'm being honest, a misunderstanding. Just a joke that got taken the wrong way. I already apologized to her." Castillo's eyes didn't blink. "A joke?" "Yes, sir." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "Tell me, Captain, which part of Army values defines public humiliation as humor?" Holland froze, "Sir." "Respect, integrity, honor," Castillo said, each word deliberate. "Are those optional where you come from?" Driscoll cleared his throat. "General, if I may, This issue's already been informally resolved. Captain Holland understands the optics were. Castillo's gaze cut through him. Optics? Colonel, this isn't a PR problem, it's a leadership failure. Silence. The general stood, slow and controlled. He placed both hands on the table. Let me make this simple. That lieutenant you humiliated, she's my daughter. The room went dead still. Driscoll's color drained. Holland's face turned white. Castillo continued quietly. Now, before you misunderstand me, this is not personal, it's professional. Because if you had treated any soldier that way, mine or not, you'd still be in this chair. The difference is, this time, there's someone here to hold you accountable. Holland's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Sir, I didn't know. I'm aware, the general said evenly. You didn't care enough to find out who you were dealing with. That's the problem. He turned toward Driscoll. And you, Colonel, when a subordinate violates standards and you choose to look away, you're complicit. You dismiss this as a joke, as if professionalism were negotiable. Driscoll's voice cracked slightly. Sir, I. Castillo raised a hand. Don't, just don't. The silence that followed was surgical. No yelling, no threat, just the heavy weight of realization pressing down on both men. Finally, the general said, effective immediately, Captain Holland is relieved of duty pending a formal command-directed investigation. He will surrender his weapon, ID, and access credentials. Colonel Driscoll, you will coordinate with brigade staff to provide all supporting documentation. Sir, Holland's voice was barely audible. With respect, that's. Dismissed, Captain, Castillo said without looking up. Holland stood shaky. The kind of silence that filled the room wasn't anger, it was consequence. He saluted stiffly, hand trembling. The general didn't return it. When they left, the base commander exhaled. Sir, that'll cause ripples. I hope it does, Castillo said softly. Ripples remind people there's still water under the surface. He gathered the papers, tapped them into order, and left without another word. Outside, the Afghan wind kicked dust across the compound. Soldiers paused as Holland walked past, his face pale, expression empty. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The laughter he once threw around so easily now sounded miles away. Bryn didn't hear about it until that evening. She was reviewing convoy manifests when Sergeant Kim knocked on her office door. Ma'am, you got a minute? She looked up. What's wrong? Nothing wrong, ma'am, he said carefully. But a rumor is Captain Holland just got relieved. Whole base is talking about it. Her pen stopped moving. Relieved? She asked, tone steady. Yes, ma'am. Investigation ordered by the general himself. She stared at the paper in front of her. The black ink of names and numbers blurred slightly. She could feel her pulse slow, her thoughts trying to catch up with the sudden shift in air. Thank you, Sergeant, she said finally. He hesitated. You knew him. I knew of him, she said, that's all. When he left, she sat in silence for a long time. Her office felt smaller, heavier. The hum of the old air conditioner filled the space like white noise. She didn't know if her father had discovered the truth or if it was coincidence. Maybe both. But she knew one thing: justice, when it came, didn't roar. It whispered. Later that night, as the base lights dimmed under blackout protocols, Bryn walked alone to the edge of the compound. The sky above Afghanistan was endless, dusty black, scattered with stars. Somewhere out there, a convoy rolled through the dark, headlights flickering like fireflies in the distance. She thought about her father, not as a general, but as the man who taught her to shoot, to stand still, to listen before speaking. She imagined him sitting in some command tent, reading her words on paper, realizing the story behind them. She didn't know what he felt: anger, shame, pride, but she hoped it wasn't guilt. Because she hadn't wanted revenge, just respect. Behind her, faint footsteps approached. A shadow stopped a few feet away. Ma'am, said a voice she recognized instantly. She turned. It was her father. No stars, no ceremony, just the two of them in the dust. "Sir," she said softly. He studied her for a long time. Then, "You handled yourself well." Her throat tightened. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once. "We don't need to talk about it." "I know." For a moment neither spoke, just the sound of the desert. Then he said, almost as if to himself, "You made the right choice. Silence is harder than anger." She looked at him, eyes steady. "You taught me that." He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Then I guess you were listening." He turned, started walking back toward the command area, and she watched him go. The desert wind picked up again, carrying the smell of oil and dust. When he was gone, she looked back at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, dawn would come. And for the first time in days, she let herself breathe. Not relief, not triumph, just peace. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It arrives quietly, dressed in uniform, carrying paperwork and dignity in equal measure. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge is professionalism. Because it leaves no blood, only silence. How does silence turn into strength? For Bryn, the days that followed felt surreal. The base was the same, dusty, loud, predictable, but something underneath had changed. Conversations stopped when she passed. Salutes came a little sharper. Even laughter in the chow hall carried a new restraint. Everyone knew. Not the full story, maybe, but enough. A captain had been relieved of duty. An investigation was underway, and the quiet lieutenant from the motor pool had something to do with it. Bryn didn't speak about it. Not to her platoon, not to her peers, not even to her father. She didn't need to. Her soldiers followed her example. They stayed professional, worked harder, and avoided gossip. In a place where rumor traveled faster than supply trucks, that was rare. But still, the weight of it hung in the air. That morning she stood on the catwalk overlooking the convoy yard, clipboard in hand, the sun still low and gold over the ridges. Trucks lined in formation below her, diesel engines growling awake. She watched the dust swirl, the chaos of readiness turning into rhythm. Sergeant Kim climbed up beside her. "Convoy 3's ready to roll, ma'am. Last-minute maintenance checks are green." "Good," she said. "Tell the drivers to double-check comms redundancy. Last run we lost signal outside the pass." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, glancing at her sideways. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, people are watching. How you handled everything, it's got the whole base talking." She turned her gaze to him. "That's supposed to make me feel better, Sergeant." He smiled faintly. "No, ma'am, just saying it matters. Seeing someone stay calm when everyone else would have lost it, it gives people something to believe in." Bryn didn't reply. She didn't know how. Compliments made her uncomfortable, especially ones born from something ugly. She looked back over the yard, eyes tracing the movement of soldiers prepping vehicles. "Belief doesn't keep trucks running," she said softly. "Discipline does." He nodded. "Still, sometimes discipline is belief." That line stayed with her long after he walked away. By noon, the convoy rolled out, 13 vehicles, dust trails twisting behind them like ghosts. Bryn watched them until they disappeared into the desert haze. She turned back toward the command building, the sound of the engines fatting, replaced by the steady thump of helicopter rotors somewhere to the east. Inside, the base commander's office buzzed with a quiet tension. The command-directed investigation had officially begun. Paperwork moved fast now. Statements were being taken, timelines verified. Witnesses were interviewed one by one, their accounts cross-checked with maintenance logs and radio reports. Every soldier who'd been in the motor pool that day had something to say. Some spoke carefully, afraid of repercussions. Others spoke freely, relieved that someone was finally listening. Patterns emerged, small, consistent stories about Captain Holland's behavior, dismissive jokes, comments that crossed lines, a history of undermining subordinates, the kind of rot that hides under good performance metrics until someone drags it into daylight. The investigator, a major from brigade staff, wrote everything down with the precision of a surgeon. There were no theatrics, just facts stacking quietly like bricks. Holland, meanwhile, sat in a temporary office on the far side of the base. His weapon confiscated, duties revoked, his uniform suddenly too heavy. He told himself it would blow over, that the general was only making a point. But inside he knew better. The laughter that used to follow him had vanished. He ate alone. In the evenings, Bryn could feel the shift in morale. Soldiers carried themselves differently. Conversations at the motor pool had turned quieter, sharper, more respectful. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. The kind that happens when people realize someone's always watching, even when no one seems to care. And through it all she worked. Same hours, same focus. Late one night, while reviewing resupply schedules, she caught her reflection in the dark window. The exhaustion showed, the faint shadows under her eyes, the thin line between pride and weariness. She thought about what her father had said. Silence is harder than anger. He was right. Silence took patience. It took faith that dignity still meant something in a world that rewarded noise. A soft knock came at her door. It was Hayes. "Evening, Lieutenant." "Sir," she stood. "Status update." He shook his head. "No, just checking in. Thought you'd want to know, formal reprimands likely. They found multiple prior complaints. None documented properly, but enough to show pattern." Bryn nodded slowly. "So it won't disappear." "Not this time," Hayes said. "You did the right thing, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of how you handled it." She gave a small smile. "Thank you, sir." As he left, she felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't joy, just a quiet satisfaction that doing the right thing still meant something. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose metal siding of the office. She stepped out for air. The desert night was alive with distant sounds, generators humming, a convoy returning, laughter echoing faintly from the barracks, normal life resuming. But inside, she knew something deeper had shifted. The next morning, she attended a base-wide briefing in the operations tent. Officers from multiple units gathered, nervous energy thick in the air. General Castillo stood at the front, calm, deliberate, his presence commanding without effort. "This is not a disciplinary meeting," he began. "It's a reminder. Leadership is not ownership. It's stewardship. Every soldier you lead carries your example more than your orders." No one moved. He looked across the room, eyes settling briefly, almost imperceptibly on Bryn before scanning the rest. "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And silence, gentlemen, is consent. That ends today." The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that isn't comfortable but cleansing, the kind that strips away excuses. After the briefing, Bryn slipped out quietly, blending into the crowd. She didn't want recognition. She didn't need it. She just wanted to do her job. Later that day, while inspecting a convoy manifest, she overheard two young soldiers talking near the maintenance bay. "Did you hear what the general said?" one whispered. "Yeah, I think he meant." "Don't say it," the other cut in quickly. "Just be better." She almost smiled, almost. That night, a message came through official channels. Subject: Command Investigation Results, Captain Derek Holland. Outcome: General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, Permanent File. Disposition: Reassignment to Rear Command. She read it twice, then closed her laptop. It was over. No parade, no satisfaction, just closure. But sometimes closure doesn't look like victory. It looks like peace, quiet, private, and unseen. Later that evening, she met her father one last time before his team rotated out. He found her outside near the motor pool, the same place it had all started. "Heading back to Bagram tomorrow," he said. She nodded. "Understood, sir." He studied her for a moment. "You could have called me." "I didn't want to use your name," she said simply. He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you didn't." For a long time, neither spoke. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sand into liquid gold. He finally said, "You did well, Bryn." "Thank you, sir." He looked out toward the horizon. "You know, sometimes leadership is just how you stand when people try to bend you. You didn't bend." She smiled faintly. "Guess I learned from you." He chuckled softly. "You learned to be better." They shook hands, not as father and daughter, as soldiers. When he left, Bryn stayed until the stars came out. The motor pool was quiet now. The same concrete, the same vehicles, but different somehow. Cleaner, lighter. She thought about everything that had happened. The coke, the humiliation, the silence, the investigation, the justice that came without noise. And as the desert wind swept through the yard, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just acts." Then she turned, walked back toward her office, and the lights of the base faded behind her. Because the mission never ends, not for those who believe in the uniform more than themselves. What happens to a soldier after the storm passes? For Bryn Castillo, peace didn't come with silence, it came with distance. A few months after the investigation closed, the base at Ghazni began winding down operations. Troops rotated home. Convoys grew shorter. The war, at least for them, was fading into memory. But some memories never fade. They just change color with time. On her final morning in Afghanistan, Bryn stood on the flight line as the C-17 engines roared to life. The air was sharp with dust and jet fuel, the sunrise bleeding across the horizon like molten copper. She carried one duffel bag, no medals, no trophies, just her gear and a stack of worn notebooks. A few soldiers came to see her off. Sergeant Kim was one of them. "Feels strange, ma'am," he said, eyes squinting against the light. "You've been the calm in this circus." She smiled faintly. "That's just army talk for boring, Sergeant." He grinned. "Not to us." He hesitated, then added quietly, "You taught us something important, that strength doesn't always yell." Her expression softened. "Thank you." They shook hands, the kind of handshake that carries words you don't say out loud. When the transport ramp began to rise, Bryn climbed aboard and didn't look back. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, she stared out the small window. The desert rolled away beneath her, the mountains shrinking into nothing. For the first time in months, she exhaled without feeling watched. But freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt unfinished. Back in the States, Fort Drum looked like another world, green, wet, full of noise that wasn't mortars or convoys. She was reassigned to Logistics Command while her out-processing began. Her days filled with briefings, inventories, and the kind of paperwork that made time blur together. At night she dreamed of the motor pool, of dripping coke, of silence heavy enough to choke on, and she'd wake up with her fists clenched, the sound of diesel engines still in her ears. She told no one about the dreams. That wasn't how officers operated. One afternoon, while signing clearance forms, she crossed paths with Hayes for the last time. He shook her hand firmly. "Army needs more officers like you," he said, "ones who don't lose themselves in the noise." "Maybe it just needs quieter ones," she replied. He smiled. "Same thing sometimes." She thought about that as she packed her things later that evening. Her career wasn't over, she could have stayed. But something inside her wanted a different kind of service. Something beyond supply chains and rank. Something that mattered but didn't wear medals. So she left, honorably discharged at 31. Civilians think leaving the military is like walking out of a building. But it is. It's like walking out of a storm and realizing you can still hear thunder even when the sky's clear. Bryn settled in Austin first. Took a quiet job with a disaster relief organization that managed logistics for humanitarian crises. Floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, places where people needed supplies, order, and someone calm in chaos. She was good at it. Too good. Within a year she was leading missions across states, coordinating convoys again. But this time they carried food and medicine, not ammunition. And yet, sometimes when she stood in the middle of a chaotic warehouse, barking instructions over the rumble of forklifts, she'd catch herself using the same tone she'd used in Afghanistan. Steady, focused, controlled. People listened, and they trusted her. They didn't need to know why she was calm under pressure. They just saw it and followed. But leadership doesn't erase memory. On one particularly long night in Louisiana, after a hurricane had gutted half the coastline, she found herself alone in a dark operations trailer. The power flickered. Rain hammered the roof. Volunteers had gone to sleep in cots. She sat at a folding table, sipping cold coffee, staring at a wet map of supply routes. And for a moment she saw the motor pool again. The same silence, the same humiliation. But instead of pain, she felt gratitude. Because that day, ugly as it was, had taught her who she was when no one clapped, no one cared, and everyone looked away. It had taught her that strength isn't loud, it's measured, it's quiet decisions in loud rooms. She leaned back in her chair, listening to the rain. Somewhere deep in her chest, the sound felt like peace. A few years later, at a veterans conference, she ran into an old face, Captain Holland. Or rather, former Captain Holland. He looked older, softer. Civilian clothes, quiet voice. He noticed her first. She could tell by the way he froze mid-step. "Lieutenant Castillo," he said automatically, then corrected himself. "Bryn, it's been a while." "It has," she said calmly. He nodded awkwardly, eyes darting to the floor. "I heard you left the army." "I did." I wanted to say, he swallowed. "I'm sorry, not just for what happened, for not realizing what it meant. I thought leadership was about being seen. Turns out it's about being remembered, and not for the wrong reasons." She studied him for a long moment. There was no anger left in her, only clarity. "Thank you," she said finally. "That means something." He gave a small, almost broken smile. "You handled it better than I deserved." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some apologies don't need forgiveness to have weight. When he left, she sat alone for a while, watching the crowd move around her. Veterans of every age, some laughing, some distant, all carrying ghosts. She realized that everyone, in their own way, was carrying a Coke someone else had poured. Everyone had a moment when dignity was tested. And maybe, she thought, that's what resilience really was. Not bouncing back, but standing still when everything tries to push you down. That night, as she walked back to her hotel through the soft hum of city lights, she passed a recruiting billboard. It showed a soldier saluting under a bright flag with the words, "Integrity, honor, respect." She smiled faintly. "Still the right words," she whispered. Years later, Bryn would be asked to speak at leadership seminars for young officers. She'd tell them stories, not about heroics, but about small moments of choice. She asked, "What do you do when someone disrespects you in front of your team? When you could lash out but don't? When silence becomes the only language that still carries weight?" Most wouldn't have answers. That was okay. She finished each talk with the same quiet reflection. Strength isn't about rank, it's about restraint. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the leader. Sometimes it's the one who says nothing and still changes everything. Then she'd pause, letting the silence fill the room before adding softly, "And if you ever forget that, remember this: dignity doesn't shout. It stands tall and lets time do the talking." When the applause came, she'd nod politely and leave the stage, her mind already somewhere else. Maybe back in that motor pool in the Afghan sun, when the world seemed unfair, and she refused to break. Because that was the day she learned that respect isn't given. It's earned, and sometimes quietly defended. And for Bryn Castillo, that was enough. How do you lead when no one's watching? Years after Afghanistan, Bryn Castillo found herself far from sand and camouflage. The deserts had been replaced by flooded towns, collapsed bridges, and supply routes carved through chaos. The patch on her sleeve no longer read U.S. Army, but Relief Operations. Different mission, same purpose. It was 2023, and she was standing in a ruined coastal city in the Philippines, days after a typhoon had wiped out half the province. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and loss. Her team had been working for 72 straight hours, delivering food, building makeshift shelters, rerouting convoys around washed-out roads. She was in charge now, Director Castillo, a title that carried more weight than comfort. Her headset crackled. "Ma'am, Convoy Delta stranded 2 clicks east. Bridge collapsed." "Casualties?" she asked. "Negative, but they're exposed. Locals are crowding the trucks." She closed her eyes for half a second, then said, "Divert Echo Convoy. Drop supplies, get civilians under cover. No arguments." Her voice was calm, measured. The same tone she'd used in Afghanistan when the difference between calm and panic was life or death. When she hung up, one of her younger team leads, a fresh logistics graduate named Marcy, looked at her in awe. "How do you not lose it, ma'am? Everyone's exhausted. Nothing's working right." Bryn smiled faintly, "Because losing it doesn't help anyone." Marcy laughed softly. "Guess that's why they put you in charge." But that wasn't it. Leadership wasn't about calm, it was about conviction. Later that day, rain started again, hard and relentless. Roads turned to rivers. The camp generators sputtered under waterlogged tarps. Someone shouted that the supply drone went down in the jungle. Another crisis. Another chance to lose composure. Bryn didn't. She moved through the chaos like she had back then, steady, unflinching, drenched but composed. She helped lift a crate out of the mud, barked clear orders, double-checked manifests. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, but her voice never cracked. That night when the rain eased, her team gathered under a leaking tent. They were soaked, muddy, bone-tired, but laughing. Someone had managed to get the coffee warm again. Marcy looked at her across the flickering lantern light. "You really never panic, do you?" Bryn shrugged. "I just remember that people follow tone before they follow orders. You stay steady, they stay steady." Marcy nodded quiet. "You sound like my old co." Bryn smiled. "Then your co was worth remembering." She didn't tell them that her own lesson came from humiliation, not heroism. That the strength they saw was born from silence in a motor pool a lifetime ago. Days later, the relief mission was nearing its end when a small ethical storm hit. One of the local contractors had been caught diverting supplies, stealing food meant for refugees. The team was furious, ready to confront him publicly. But Bryn stopped them. "Not here," she said firmly. "We fix this with documentation, not shouting. Integrity doesn't need an audience." The next morning she called the local governor, filed a quiet report. The contractor was removed. No headlines, no drama, just quiet justice. Later, one of her field coordinators asked, "Why not call him out? Let everyone see the example." Bryn wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Because dignity works both ways. Even when someone's wrong, you don't have to destroy them to correct them. The man nodded slowly. "Guess that's rare these days." She smiled faintly. "So was patience, until someone taught me it wasn't weakness." That night, as the last convoy rolled out, she stood alone under a bruised sky. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. Somewhere in the distance, a local child waved at the passing trucks, small hands splashing in puddles. Bryn felt something loosen in her chest, peace maybe, or something close to it. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old contact, Sergeant Kim. "Ma'am, heard about your work overseas. Still making us proud. Funny how the quiet ones always change the world." She stared at the message for a long moment before replying simply, "Still learning how to stand tall, Sergeant." Weeks later, she was invited to a global leadership summit. The audience wasn't soldiers this time. It was humanitarians, doctors, engineers. But the questions were the same. How do you lead people through chaos? How do you stay calm when everything breaks? She walked on stage, lights hot on her face, looked at the crowd, took a breath. Leadership, she began, isn't about power, it's about peace. It's the ability to hold your ground when the world loses its balance. Sometimes that means speaking up, but sometimes, she paused. Sometimes it means saying nothing, just standing there, steady enough for others to find their footing. The audience was silent, listening. She continued, voice softer now. Years ago, someone tried to humiliate me in front of 30 soldiers. I didn't yell. I didn't fight back. I just stood still. And I learned something that day. Silence, when it's built on self-respect, isn't weakness. It's strength refusing to waste itself. The hall stayed silent for a heartbeat. Then applause filled the space, slow, sincere, rising until it became a wave. She smiled once, stepped back from the podium and let it wash over her, not pride but closure. Outside, as she walked through the warm night air, she looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, in another time, a younger version of herself was standing in a dusty motor pool, coke dripping from her hair, fists clenched but unbroken. That version of her didn't know that silence would one day save lives. She whispered to the sky, almost a prayer. Dignity doesn't speak, it just acts. And then she smiled, because finally, after all the noise, the world had heard her anyway. What happens when integrity is tested not by enemies, but by friends? It had been almost a decade since Bryn Castillo last wore the uniform. Time had softened the edges of memory, but not the lessons. She was 40 now, steady, composed, a woman who carried her past like a compass instead of a wound. The world knew her as the director of Aegis Relief, one of the most respected disaster logistics organizations on the planet. She built it from the ground up, hundreds of volunteers, contracts with the UN, convoys in over 20 countries. Her name carried quiet weight. When Bryn Castillo spoke, people listened. But even the strongest structures are tested by the storms they survive. It was late autumn when the next one came. A massive earthquake struck the Balkans, 6, 8 on the scale, entire towns flattened. Bryn's team was deployed within 48 hours, moving food, generators, and medical aid through shattered roads and panicked crowds. On the surface, it was another mission, but deep down it felt different. There was a tension in the air, between relief teams, between governments, between those who wanted credit and those who wanted control. Logistics wasn't just about trucks anymore. It was politics wrapped in mud and fatigue. One evening, inside a dim operations tent, Bryn's deputy, Alan Mertz, a man she'd trusted for years, came to her with a proposal. "Listen," he said, voice low. "The regional director wants us to reroute part of the medical shipment to the capital. They're planning a press conference. Says it'll show donors we're making progress." Bryn frowned. "That shipment for the mountain clinics. They haven't had antibiotics for 3 days. "I know," Alan said quickly, "but this isn't my call, orders from above." She stared at him. Orders from politicians, not field command. He hesitated. "Bryn, they fund us. If we push back, we lose the next grant. You know how this works." She leaned forward. "And if we give in, what happens to the kids dying up there? Who speaks for them?" Alan didn't answer. That night, long after the radios went silent, Bryn sat alone by the supply tent, watching her breath curl in the cold. She could hear the trucks idling, the distant rumble of aftershocks. She thought about her father, about the army, about how corruption wore so many uniforms, sometimes camouflage, sometimes suits. Integrity is what you do when no one can punish you for not having it. She picked up the satellite phone and made a call, not to donors, not to media, to the local convoy lead. "Divert the trucks north," she said. "Deliver to the mountain hospitals first." "Ma'am, HQ just radioed." "I know, I'll handle HQ." She hung up, heart steady. The next morning the storm broke. Her decision spread through the network like wildfire. Headquarters demanded answers. The regional director was furious. Alan avoided her eyes. They called it insubordination. She called it principle. For 2 days she fought it quietly through emails, reports, video calls. Her tone never rose. Her reasoning never wavered. And when the press finally reached the mountain hospitals, cameras captured something no memo could justify. Rows of patients alive because the trucks had come in time. The story went viral. Relief convoy defies orders, saves hundreds. HQ backpedaled. The donors doubled down. The politicians smiled for cameras and called it a collective success. But those who knew the truth looked at Bryn differently now, not as an administrator, but as a leader who still followed the same code that once guided her through war. A week later, Alan came to her tent, shame heavy in his voice. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "You risked everything for people who will never even know your name." Bryn looked at him, calm as ever. "They don't need to know my name, they just need to live." He nodded. "You always did play the long game." She smiled faintly. "No, I just remember what my father taught me. Rank without character is just noise." That night she couldn't sleep. She walked to the edge of the camp, boots crunching on broken gravel, wind cold against her face. The mountains loomed dark in the distance. Somewhere up there in the small clinics her trucks had reached, lights were still burning, lives still breathing. She closed her eyes. The hum of generators sounded like the motor pool again. The same rhythm, the same lesson. Sometimes justice didn't need punishment, it needed presence. And sometimes leadership wasn't about doing what was allowed. It was about doing what was right when it cost you everything. When she returned to camp, dawn was breaking over the hills. She poured herself a cup of bitter coffee, the kind that tasted like dust and grit. Her team gathered around the map table, waiting for orders. She looked at them, all tired, all watching her. And in that moment she saw it, the reflection of the soldier she once was, the one who stood in silence and refused to bend. "All right," she said softly, "let's get back to work." The room came alive again, radios, laughter, motion. But under it all, something steady pulsed. Respect. The kind that doesn't need medals or headlines. Later, as the sun climbed higher, a young volunteer stopped her on the way out. "Director Castillo," she said shyly, "I read that quote you keep taped to your desk. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just acts. What does it mean?" Bryn paused, then smiled. "It means that real strength never announces itself. It just leaves things better than it found them." The volunteer nodded, still trying to understand. Bryn turned toward the road, her shadow stretching long behind her in the morning light. She had become what she'd always hoped to be. Not loud, not famous, but quietly unbreakable. Because when the world forgets how to lead, it listens to those who don't need to shout. What does legacy sound like when it doesn't speak? Years passed. The world changed again. New wars, new disasters, new names in the headlines. But some stories lived quietly beneath the noise, carried in the hearts of those who'd seen what dignity looked like up close. Bryn Castillo never became famous. She didn't write a book, didn't chase cameras. She led until she didn't need to anymore, then taught others how to lead without losing themselves. By her late 40s, she had turned Aegis Relief into an organization known less for its size and more for its culture: calm, precise, respectful. Every new recruit received the same small card on their first day. Printed on it were 5 words: "Do it right," even unseen. No one questioned where the phrase came from. In 2030, after 20 years of service, first in uniform, then in humanitarian work, Bryn quietly stepped down. No ceremony, no speeches. She simply left the next director a handwritten note: "Lead with respect. The rest will follow." Then she disappeared into a slower life. She bought a small cabin outside San Antonio, near the same hills where her father had taught her to shoot. The mornings there were quiet, dew on the grass, distant sound of traffic from the highway, the world moving without urgency. Her father had passed a few years earlier. When she visited his grave, she brought no flowers, only silence, because silence was what they had always shared best. Sometimes she'd sit on the porch with a mug of coffee and think about the chain of small choices that had shaped her life. A Coke can, a motor pool, a choice to stay calm when the world expected anger. It was strange, she thought, how something humiliating could become the foundation for everything she believed in. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address. It read, "Ma'am, you don't know me, but I served under Captain Holland years after Afghanistan. He told us your story, not to defend himself, but to remind us what real leadership looks like. Said he once learned the hardest way that silence can be louder than shouting. I thought you should know that your story changed more people than you'll ever meet. Respectfully, L.T. Casey Vance." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside her old Army journal. That night she couldn't sleep. Memories returned, not sharp, not painful, just present. The motor pool under a scorching Afghan sun, the laughter, the silence, the moment she chose restraint over rage. She realized, after all these years, that her silence had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. Because silence isn't the absence of power, it's the mastery of it. Weeks later, she was invited to give one last talk at a military academy, future officers, eager and restless, sitting in crisp uniforms. She stood before them, silver now streaking through her hair, eyes still sharp, voice calm. "Leadership," she began, "isn't about rank or shouting or getting the last word. It's about steadiness when you're humiliated, patience when you're angry, and grace when no one deserves it. Anyone can command fear. It takes courage to command respect." The hall was silent. She let the quiet stretch, like a heartbeat before truth lands. "Years ago," she continued, "someone poured a Coke on my head in front of my soldiers. I said nothing, because sometimes you don't need to remind people who you are. Time will." She paused, then smiled faintly. "So if you remember anything from this talk, remember this: dignity doesn't defend itself. It just stands there unbroken until the world catches up." When she finished, no one moved. Then a single cadet in the back rose to his feet. One by one, the rest followed. No cheers, no noise, just a standing silence, the highest kind of respect. After the event, as she left the building, the young cadet who'd stood first caught up to her. "Ma'am," he said breathlessly, "I think I understand now. Dignity isn't pride, is it?" She shook her head. "No, pride shouts, dignity listens." He nodded slowly, memorizing the words like a promise. Outside, the wind was cool against her face. The campus flags flapped softly in the breeze. Somewhere beyond, a bugle played retreat. She stopped and turned back toward the field, her eyes catching the last orange glow of the setting sun. That moment, the color, the quiet, the distant echo of something eternal, felt like closure. Not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that confirms it mattered. Because in the end, her life hadn't been about revenge or recognition. It had been about holding a line no one could see, standing firm in moments that demanded more restraint than strength. And the world, slowly but surely, had learned from her example. In a world full of noise, her silence had built an empire of respect. As dusk fell and the first stars appeared, she whispered one last truth to herself, the same words that had followed her through every storm, every mission, every moral crossroad. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Then she smiled, turned toward the fading light and walked away, steady, composed, and free. And in the hush that followed, her legacy kept walking with her,